Well, welcome to the July meeting of the Colorado Mycological Society. I have a few announcements just to go over business-wise, and then we'll have our guest speaker. Let's see. All right, so I think the first thing that everybody has to understand, we are a group that is made up of volunteers. All right, everything from our newsletter editors. Everybody seen this yet? You getting the newsletters? The president, the webmaster. I mean, everybody's volunteer. And so if you are interested in contributing even the minimal, there's plenty of opportunities to do that. I know in the newsletter, there were emails that you can reach out to connect with the right people to volunteer your time. Our mushroom fair coming up in August is the big one that we could definitely use help with, and no experience necessary. We have fair set up on the 9th, and then the fair is typoed there, but it should be the 10th. And so, let me just check that, sorry. But yeah, I mean, and like I said, no experience necessary. Don't feel that you have to be an expert in order to just devote your time or spend some time with us. But I know in the newsletter, there's all that information for you. All right. I have an opportunity to bring up real quick as well. And Jeff Ravage is here to go over this offer, this opportunity that might be interesting for somebody.
Yeah, hi, my name is Jeff Ravage. I'm a member of the Colorado Mycological Society, and I'm a forest ecology scientist. I've been working for about 11 or 12 years on mycological investigations for dealing with biomass that's produced for forest mitigation, and also dealing with post-fire restoration, which actually I've been working post-fire restoration for almost 20 years now. We have a lab now, and we're doing large scale, both scientific experiments and demonstration projects across Colorado. And we're looking for volunteers and for an intern. We have some funding for a part-time intern here in Denver, Colorado. Our lab is over by National Renewable Energy Lab in Golden. And if you are interested, you can go to our website, which is coldfireproject.com. And if you're here in the auditorium, I'll have a sign-up sheet at the end of the presentation today. So you can sign up, quiz me, and find out more about it. So basically, what we will be doing is we'll be creating large amounts of spawn of mushrooms that have been conditionally trained to target biomass. And those mushrooms will be taken rapidly out into the field in what's working on right now. We'll be going Evergreen, Frisco, and Estes Park. So anyway, let us know if you're interested. You can go to the website also and send me a direct email. So thanks for your time. And if you're interested, come and join us. We have a lot of fun.
That doesn't stick that way. Yeah, this guy's a little touchy. No. Let's take a look. All right, and the QR code there is also will take you to the website with the specific details about the application process and all the other information. And I mean, that's time, 10 years on this project alone, but you said 20 years. So
yeah,
that's you're in the sweet spot now, I think. All right. All right. Just one more push for iNaturalist. If you're not on this yet, please do. And it's not just fungi. You can take pictures of bugs and plants and all kinds of life forms. But we do have a CMS project that we're trying to keep track of just for people to document what's going on out there. This link here, the observation guide, does have kind of more specific details on how to take pictures and what to take pictures of. This was also linked in our newsletter. So if you're interested, please help. Citizen science is a big part of what we do. So could definitely use the numbers. All right, so this list here, just identifying some of the things that are upcoming if you are interested in more mushroom stuff. The Eagle Festival, unfortunately, it runs about the same time as our fair. But that is in its 16th year now, and they have a new director that's kind of changing how it's working. Our fair coming the 10th. It's here at the Denver Botanic Gardens, and definitely, if you are interested in volunteering, please, we could use your help. Tellurides Festival coming up in the third week of August. This is their 45th year that they've been running that festival. Paul Stamets is one of the keynote speakers. And if you haven't heard of Paul Stamets yet, look him up. He's everywhere. All right. NAMA, the annual foray in Vermont this year. And so that's coming up in early September. Just some things to kind of keep on your radar. All right. So on to our presenter. So I just met Madeline DeDe-Panken today briefly, but I have seen some of her work, and I'm interested in the history, the culture of mushrooms. Most of the talks that we have here at CMS focus on the physical science. This one is something I'm interested in, but it's going to focus on more of the historical side of mycology. And so I asked if she was an ethnomycologist, and she kind of corrected me and said, well, I'm a historian of mycology. And I think that sounds a little bit more classy. She's coming up to us from Boston, and so was able to go on a foray yesterday, I believe. And we are glad to have her. So let's hear it for Madeline DeDe-Panken. Switch you up. Sure you are full screen. Cool. And it's just advance, and afterwards, if there's questions, I'll share.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me here in Colorado. I'm so happy to be out here. I'm happy to have gotten out to the real mountains. We have some hills in the Northeast, but get out some real mountains while I've been out here and find some fungi. And thank you especially to Alexis, who's on Zoom, for helping set this all up. Before I start, I always like to do a quick land acknowledgement. Especially because my talk focuses mostly on the history of white Anglo-American foraging practices. And so today in Colorado, we're on traditional Ute and Cheyenne homelands. And so I'll be talking today about the formation of popular mycology in the United States, and particularly women's important roles in that. Their kind of part as mushroom club matriarchs in early mycology. So thanks for letting a historian and a humanities person interlope into this biological fungal space. Yeah.
Sorry about that. I wasn't sharing the screen to our remote viewers. Thank you, Devin. You bet.
All right. Yeah. All right. Let's make sure everyone can see that now. I do have many images, so it's definitely good to get that going. Okay, so my interest in mycology kind of began with and continues to be very heavily informed by its history. I kind of fell backwards into all of this. And I always say that I came to mushrooms, but also mushrooms came to me while looking into women's roles in science as part of my graduate studies at the Graduate Center at CUNY. And so in summer 2017, so many years ago now, I was in the archives of the New York Botanical Garden, and I found myself kind of drawn to these historic pamphlets and journals that were mycological journals, and kind of part cookbook, and kind of intermingled all of these different vectors of scientific and popular and culinary interest. And women's names were kind of all over the pages, and I was confused, and it undermined a lot of what I thought I knew about women in science. And so I just kind of kept following that thread and uncovering it. And The project has grown and grown, and so now I am finishing up a dissertation in US history on the history of popular foraging in the United States, focusing from about the 1880s to the 1920s and looking specifically at women's roles in food and science, and also thinking more broadly about forms of knowledge and authority. So how we know what we know, how different people's knowledge and different types of knowledge are legitimized and given, voice and gravitas and understanding. Okay, so as most of people in this room and on Zoom are intimately aware, we are kind of in this mushroom moment right now, this real reckoning of popular mycology. You can see Merlin Sheldrakes, Entangled Life, Paul Stamets' fantastic fungi up there. We're just really in this very exciting moment for popular mycological interest. And so, perhaps if we go back and we think about where did this come from? Where did the roots or the hyphae of this kind of arise? Perhaps most well known is that heady psilocybin love that was popularized in the late 1950s, thanks to the Watson's encounters with Mazatec healer Maria Sabina. But today I want to take us even further back to kind of the 1880s and before. So before the 1880s, mushrooms were seldom found on American tables, and mycology was among the least popular naturalist pursuits. They were shunned as mysterious and dangerous, and so-called toadstools were linked to evil and witchcraft. And there's this rare reference in an 1857 cookbook and says the taste for mushrooms is an acquired one. It's best not to acquire it. So fungi also eluded the order that Enlightenment-inspired practitioners of science so fervently sought during the late 18th and 19th centuries, which hindered progress and interest. And scholars like Patricia Cashin have argued that wariness and outright hostility directly sabotaged understanding of this group for hundreds of years. So there was this real kind of mycophobia and stepping back from mushrooms, kind of not dealing with them because of their associations, both culturally and also their difficulty and complexity biologically. But for a remarkable moment in the 1880s, mushrooms became popular among the general lay populace. It was at the turn of the 20th century when fungi first captured Americans' attention as culinary and biological curiosities. And this was, as I call it, America's first mushroom fad. And one author has also called it a veritable fungus frenzy. So how did this happen? Numerous factors converged to generate newfound interest in wild mushrooms as food. Urbanization, industrialization, and rising immigration generated this potent mix where waves of immigrants were bringing mushroom eating habits to American soil, introducing a wide range of cuisines from cultures like Italy, Germany, Russia, Eastern Europe, and Asia, all much more mycophilic cultures than kind of Anglo-American. And cosmopolitan Epicureanism put mushrooms on the menu. The rise of restaurant culture encouraged Anglo-Americans to sample novel dishes and ingredients from across the world. And many people started partaking in French dining, where fancy champignons stewed and boiled and baked and doused with cream. And this was a way to kind of show off worldly sophistication at the same time as German bars and exotic Chinese eateries were proving grounds for sociability and worldly cosmopolitanism. And culinary advice kind of inspired even those without wealth to dine out, to try these immigrant cuisines. So we have this kind of America's melting pot as a literal metaphor with mushrooms on the menu. Simultaneously, nutrition science introduced eating well through quality over quantity. Vitamins and calories became key measures of health, and mushrooms were studied as wholesome, high vitamin, and low-cost meat substitutes, specifically for urban poor environments. And focus on healthfulness also brought more people into natural environments. This was a moment of real outdoor leisure, as hiking and camping became popular as a respite from crowded cities. And there was this real enchantment with outdoor recreation, a la Teddy Roosevelt. Here you can see avid mycologist C.G. Lloyd before in his dudery, in his dude-dumb finery, and after the study of fungi in this more kind of rugged, outdoorsy, Teddy Roosevelt naturalist-inspired garb. So this all kind of opened up Anglo-Americans to mushroom possibilities. So domestic authorities and reformers and government agencies all promoted edible fungi, which were expensive and inaccessible at market, as nourishing economical delicacies that could enrich American foodways, stretch food budgets, promote efficient eating, prevent wastefulness, and bolster personal health. So by 1898, it could realistically be said in The Practical Housekeeper that mushrooms are greatly used in domestic cookery and are a general favorite. So leaders like Boston Cooking School head Fanny Farmer advised women to take advantage of wild mushrooms' multi-pronged value. A basket at a time, people could bring to their tables what is in quality luxury, but in cost, one of the cheapest of all the foods. And an 1890 article chided that those who did not partake were poor simpletons who will live and die without enjoying one of the most perfect productions of nature, freely given and within the reach of many. So we see this kind of echo of why people are brought into the mycological community today, this mix of nature and culinary and science that kind of all blends together into mycophilia and mycophagy. So trendy, wholesome, freely obtainable in nature, mushrooms have all of this wonderful stuff to offer. And new populations came to the field seeking this culinary and intellectual and personal enrichment. But of course, there was a hitch. Many mushrooms are delicious, others are deadly poison. And to earn a place on the table, collectors and cooks had to learn which was which. Now, countless food fads have kind of come and gone, but few have been tinged with the possibility of death. Mushrooms were therefore a very risky and exciting double-edged form of sustenance, both delightful to the palate and dreadful to the imagination. So with mushrooms' rising popularity, horror stories abounded. As the New York Times warned in 1893, eaters of mushrooms are in constant danger of being poisoned. Mushroom season was full of risk, especially from women who were charged with culinary labor who relied on instincts or folklore. Scientific mycological was presented as the saving grace. Fears about potential poisonings made mycological undertakings into required female knowledge. Women who controlled what ended up on the family table had to be thoroughly scientifically informed, lest they misidentify and misuse these organisms deemed contagious and dangerous in their hands. Now, women were not passive receivers of this myco knowledge. They were vocal proponents, vigorously promoting mushrooms' benefits and recipes while warning of their dangers. Cookbooks, household manuals, and women's periodicals began incorporating mycological material. And here's just a small selection from Colorado newspapers, but this was happening across the country. Domestic authorities assured their readers and the wider public that the risk was both surmountable and worth it. More and more mycophagic articles appeared, cautioning there is only one safe way to eat mushrooms, and that is to acquire a knowledge of the variety that you are eating. Boston Cooking School head Fanny Farmer of Fanny Farmer Cookbook assured her readership that anyone by a little study may acquaint herself with the common varieties that were valuable for food. and this encouragement became increasingly scientific. Mary Ronald's popular Century Cookbook, written under the pseudonym Mary Ronald, but she was also a scientist and mycologist herself, devoted an entire chapter to mushrooms, using scientific names to organize field advice and suggested recipes by species. As one 1906 article advised, either avoid wild mushrooms altogether, which you don't want to do, or study the subject carefully, patiently, scientifically. So not merely appropriate, but essential, such study remained compatible with traditional gender expectations of kitchen labor and management, while pushing its boundaries outward toward public roles and intellectual pursuit for women. The practical applications of mycology and the way it entered public consciousness, not through the laboratory, but through the kitchen, enabled some women to claim authority and space, and they leveraged this cultural endorsement toward expansive mycological endeavors. Many developed a craving for further knowledge beyond the kitchen applications, to borrow this kind of ironically culinary phrase from this book, Among the Mushrooms, published by Ellen Dallas and Carolyn Burgeon in 1900. So several factors contributed to this kind of craving for further knowledge and this kind of scientific bent to what started as a culinary pursuit. So from mid-century, botanizing had been a significant intellectual and social outlet for laywomen, thanks to its association with the feminine. And by the 1890s, more women than ever before were attending college, cultivating proficiencies, and aspiring toward intellectual fulfillment. But graduates faced challenges in a culture still debating the meaning and purpose of women's education. Female capability was contested and regularly doubted. They were relegated to the sidelines in most disciplines, even as some exceptional women made trailblazing inroads. But mycology was a unique space. It offered opportunity for intellectual study for those with otherwise restricted prospects, including women and lay people. As science was becoming professionalized and required specialized degrees, institutional employment, and other markers of legitimacy, mycology remained a more navigable space, a niche, even fringe discipline that lagged behind and was now buoyed by popular interest. The dearth of prior research necessitated collaboration with local collectors who knew the landscape and could regularly return to gathering spots. And as many of us know, mushrooms' unpredictable and fragile and ephemeral nature compounded this need. Overall, there was this sense that continues to this day of the overwhelming task of mycology, the extent of what is not yet understood, and the sheer number of fungi yet to be studied. As Nina Marshall summarized in her mushroom book, there is no class of plants in which the assistance of the amateur may help the botanist more than in this. Even a layperson could potentially discover a rarity worthy of publication or new nomenclature. And the population of mycological enthusiasts continued to grow and were described by New York Botanical Garden director Lucian Underwood as an enormous crop, mushroom-like in their present growth. Even then, they were not immune to mushroom puns. Mycological clubs were important venues for generating and sustaining a range of mycological endeavors, and they were also mixed amateur professional and mixed gender, which was a rarity for the time. This picture. So from the outset, women were instrumental. The Boston Mycological Club was the first, founded in 1895. Illustrator Eliza Blackford was at that meeting, and she would later rise to become president of the club for many years. When New York cooking school head Cornelia Bedford read about the Boston Club, she led the charge to establish the New York Club in quick order. Mary Whetstone was the founder and leading light of the Minnesota Mycological Society for several decades until her death in 1929. And while I have yet to find evidence that Colorado had a dedicated club at that time, there are many indications of mycological interest. Colorado newspapers regularly included mycological articles, and avid hiker and mushroom enthusiast Edith Estabrook embarked on a month-long excursion to Colorado with the Appalachian Mountain Club, reveling in, quote, the exquisite woodland scenery. And in 1902, Cornelia Miles began to send myxomycetes, of which she assured there are such beautiful forms in Colorado to prolific correspondent and enthusiast Curtis Gates Lloyd. So this was really a national trend with bits of kind of concentration. And women regularly shaped the tenor of local mycological communities, which ensured their own place in it. Leaders proselytized accessibility. A July 1899 announcement read, "All who are interested in furthering the objects of the club and all who are in search of help in the study are to join." BMC's December 1899 bulletin urged members to bring friends and let them know that membership is easy to obtain. So this was also a rarity in this time when clubs like the Botanical Society of America limited membership to those who published, quote, worthy work and were, quote, actively engaged in botanical investigations and required sponsorships and voting to join. Mycological clubs really asserted that anybody could participate, no prior knowledge or experience required. And this was because this was never purely an academic venture. Clubs maintained their civic bent as public advisors and conduits of vital safety knowledge. There was this idea that, quote, the eagerness to gather and devour has become so general that the club ought to look upon itself as a life-saving, or better yet, death-preventing institution. And clubs were key sites of communication and collaboration between academics, non-professionals, and an anxious, myco-curious public. And women served as invaluable conduits, kind of bridging these realms. Public talks and exhibitions became important proving grounds for female leadership and guidance. And culinary roles offered special opportunities for contribution. Like mushrooms, this could be double-edged. They denoted continued consciousness of traditional, often limiting gendered roles. However, this was real, valuable, and scientific labor. Gastronomy-related tasks provided crucial data. Most wild mushrooms are inedible raw. Don't eat morels raw. Many are toxic unless cooked. Domestically skilled women capitalized on this, giving practical lectures, furnishing recipes for club events and bulletins, and even publishing in many, many popular periodicals. So this domestic knowledge, either assumed or actual, helped, and their established platforms for and access to female communities gave women special value and helped safeguard their acceptance. And muddying traditional tasks, culinary expert Annie Dowdy wrote that many have, quote, begged for the menu with directions for preparing mushrooms. Mycological men either learning basic cookery or more commonly seeding the territory. So flipping the script, women were specialists to whom male investigators appealed to supplement, strengthen, and even complete mycological study. Women provided recipes, ran cooking demonstrations, prepared club dinners, cooked, gathered specimens, and sometimes doing so even while still in the field. So you have this entwining of culinary and scientific labor, which further blurred boundaries. Science had been brought into the home, and now the home was brought into science. As women expanded the scholarly world, they also unsettled it, like challenging these divides between domestic and scientific, and feminine and masculine, and amateur and expert. By the turn of the century, you have this remarkable population of mycological women who had emerged. Female myco enthusiasts constructed a discipline where they were wanted and needed, and one where they found great fulfillment and meaning. They participated in all levels and in all kinds of ways, even without specialized degrees or formal employment. Female-authored general guidebooks offered an accessible initial way in. They actively fostered citizen science networks. As collectors, researchers, writers, illustrators, lecturers, and advisors, they acquired and shared mushroom expertise. Their names frequent mycological journals and correspondence. They grace herbaria collections. They're embedded in Latin names, and they dot corners of illustrations, both stunning and precise. Henrietta Page's summer course notes can be followed through several sessions as she rambles throughout the greater Massachusetts area, gaining confidence and skill. Artistic depictions were a popular way to celebrate, preserve, and share finds. Talented illustrators like forerunner Mary Banning, whose Lactarius you can see here, the blue one, and Eliza Blackford and Violetta Delafield White, sorry, and Anne Hibbard exhibited tremendous talent and dedication and precision. And before the onset of color photography, their work often represents the most faithful depictions of fungi from this era. One common denominator was genuine passion. Mary Whetstone echoed many when she said, "I would dearly love to devote all my time to this fascinating study." And through her mushrooming, Grace Gaines found, quote, "fresh stores of peace and nearer acquaintance with the self alongside intellectual gratification." Again, we can see so many echoes of what people find today in the mycological community. Women who took to the outdoors also asserted physical capability in ways that dovetailed with political and personal crusades for expanded education, roles, and citizenship, including voting rights. They tramped and traversed with aplomb, seeking the wild in corner patches and remote environs. While women enjoyed out-of-door pursuits and happily ate the fruits of their labor when possible, many also recognized the greater meaning of taking active roles as mycologists. Women repeatedly spoke of their desire for usefulness. Finding rarities and contributing to science was a major goal. Some, like Eliza Blackford and Gertrude Burlingham, pictured here, who was the first American woman to earn a Ph.D. in mycology, did so multiple times over, maintaining secondary and largely unpaid careers. Their names are now part of the species they first described. Burlingham was met with admiration and recognition nationwide, including here in Denver, where she was invited in 1911 to come to Colorado to collect, and was given the handwritten note alongside it by Colorado Academy of Sciences President Ellsworth Bethel, that there are many resorts in the mountains, so women can camp with safety anywhere, just kind of assuring her hosting and accessibility. So while most labored as a marginal pastime, a few managed to parlay aptitude into paid careers. Flora Patterson and Vera Charles were the first formal mycologists at the United States Department of Agriculture, conducting critical research and issuing educational bulletins. So women were really legion in this work, but also in camaraderie and in mentorship. They found connection and support both on personal and professional levels. They shared materials and information. They encouraged one another, bonded at forays, shared meals. Like-minded mycophiles, I always say, have always relished finding their people. And the curious and keen also brought people to the study. Female friendships made through mycological network were sustained over years and distances, as these cards have indicate, and many treasured the fellowship and mutual recognition of others navigating this same kind of quirky world. However, this welcoming tenor had its limits. While expanding opportunities for some, popular mycology was not equally welcoming to other, more disadvantaged populations. To substantiate claims to authority, enmesh themselves in scientific communities, prove their information safe beyond reproach, and promote foraging as part of modern American foodways, mycological enthusiasts insisted on adherence to correct scientific sources. This surely prevented lots of unpleasant experiences among novice newcomers and helped wrestle biological order out of a somewhat chaotic field. But it left no room for multiplicities of expertise and devalued alternative knowledge and approaches. Foraging is, of course, an ancient and broad practice undertaken by myriad groups for sustenance and profound social meaning. Folk and ancestral traditions had endured on the margins of American life, most often among the marginalized, Indigenous, Black, and immigrant, again, those largely Italian and Eastern European populations. And these were the populations that originally brought so many to the field, and then we see them being kind of denigrated and pushed out. Popular mushroom culture expanded gathering into more socioeconomically advantaged circles. Nearly all those that I've discussed so far were white, American-born, and affluent. Most mycophiles, including the women, had been afforded at least some formal education. They enjoyed ample leisure time. They had access to educational and technical resources, both formal and informal, and they were removed from gathering as necessary provisioning. Their goals were more about kind of Epicurean flourishes, personal gratification, intellectual edification, and scholarly participation. They also enjoyed assumptions of respectability and safety, which enabled them to traipse through woods and fields with relative impunity. Mycologers brought by the fad were not entering an empty field. For some, understanding of that was kind of hazy at best. And as they entered that field, they retooled foraging in their own image. Far from elevating all foraging practices, they consciously distanced themselves from others. Theirs was the acceptable way to forage and eat like a modern civilized American. In the process, they refashioned understandings into predominantly white middle-class pastime and an increasingly gate-kept scientific practice. Longer traditions were irrelevant or even dangerous. Indigenous foraging went unacknowledged, and obliteration of ancient connections with the land. Black traditions were similarly disregarded. And the immigrant practices that brought mushrooms to the attention of so many were collapsed and denigrated. Poisoning reports were salaciously reported. Portrayals of marginalized foragers vacillated between scorn, dissociation, and romanticization of their provinciality. Their gathering was criticized as antiquated, reckless behavior, even when evidence indicated successful reliance for generations. Immigrants maintaining customs from their homeland and supplementing diets were derided as unruly and foolish pot hunters, greedily taking over gathering spots. Some of this was born from competition over the same limited spots. One club publication teasingly declared that the really difficult thing about being a mycologist is the Italians. If a closed season isn't instituted before very long, there will be nothing left to mycologize on, what with the Italians gobbling up all of the subjects. And in 1901, a contributor to the New York Times Magazine and a mycologist named Catherine Thayer described wild mushrooms as a harvest of which we alone know the value. Emphasis mine, but it displays either ignorance or indifference to knowledge beyond her own community. So, while expanding opportunities for some, proponents of mycological culture also fueled exclusion and outdoor pursuits that we are still unraveling the impacts of today. And all of this is not to discount the value and the veracity of science or the positive impacts of mycological enthusiasts. Research-based guidance helped many avoid unpleasant experiences, even fatalities. Accurate, thorough investigation advanced mycological understanding tremendously, and quelling suspicions around fungi turned people on to new ingredients and dishes and cultivated appreciation of the earth's wonders. For many women, this was a meaningful, important venue of intellectual pursuit during a time of limited opportunities. So, while not without flaws, women were instrumental to the furtherance of mycological knowledge and the expansion of mycology as a discipline at the turn of the 20th century in ways that still matter today. Examining the multifaceted ways that they engaged in mycological pursuits helps rectify this idea that the average historical woman was disengaged from scholarly conversations, and it uncovers and renders visible the scores of women who operated in bringing science into their daily lives and bringing their knowledge and abilities to science. Their devotion to the subject was steadfast, their labor was valuable, and their contributions, though largely unrecognized, enduring. Exploring what their knowledge meant, someone's drawing on my screen, exploring what their knowledge meant and how it could be utilized, they probed gender boundaries and evoked critical questions of who and what science might include. And they really helped establish the vital groundwork for the complex and beautiful and expanding modern mycophilia that we are all a part of today. So as we gain deeper appreciation for how fungi can feed and sustain and edify and inspire us. I hope that understanding the complex history of America's first mushroom fad can inform these kind of essential conversations that are happening today about inclusivity in mycoculture. So I'm happy to take questions, and thank you so much for listening. I think this talk will be on YouTube and through the Mycological Club, and so you'll be able to find it there along with the slides. And if there's an image that you have a particular question about, I'll make my email available and you're welcome to reach out. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I love this image here, Meeting of the Mushroom Club, but one of my favorite written article sources that I just kind of touched on here is this article here about skirts warranted to shrink, that talks about Brooklyn women mycologists who are literally purchasing dresses and skirts and then overwashing them on purpose, or buying cheaper materials so that they'll shrink on purpose, so they have more freedom of movement to go out and tramp and kind of crouch in the dirt and be really kind of at one with nature. And this article by Grace Hurd-Gaines, Notes of a Mushroom Hunter, kind of talks about the same thing. She really revels in the physicality and the immediacy of mushrooming. She talks about like being out at dusk and finding her meal like a wild animal and crouching in the dirt and like smacking her lips. And it's this very, very evocative exploration of mushrooming that really brings to life what that practice looked like then and what it can still look like now.
The role of women compare in other countries? We had it, I don't saw in Europe or South America at the same time period.
Yeah, so one of the unique things about the United States is that it's in this moment of transition from very mycophobic culture to a mycophilic culture. So there's this like opening space. In other countries, in Britain, in England, there is kind of a similar thing going on. So you do have several women over there as well who are working in the mycological space. So at Kew Botanical Gardens, Mary Wakefield and Juliana Lister are two kind of big women who are in that space and doing similar work. Beyond the Anglo-speaking world, I haven't looked into so much yet, but there are kind of pockets of, in terms of like this scientifically curious mycology going on. And then there's also a lot of traditional knowledge that women specifically hold in many, many cultures across the globe. And many of them bring that knowledge with them to the United States. So some of like the first generation immigrants, this woman here, Dominica Castagna, who settles in the Pacific Northwest and kind of becomes the premier local mushroomer in her Italian immigrant community there. So there's certainly like a cross global pollination. Yes. There. It's both. So yeah, so there's a lot of outsized attention given to Italians. Partly that is because there is you know, a lot of mycophilia in Italian culture. but partly that was because a lot of Italians lived in densely populated urban areas as immigrants. And so their foodways came up against Anglo-American foodways in ways that were incredibly fraught. So through reform movements, there was a lot of conversation around Italians, foodways thinking of garlic and being un-American. There's a lot of conversation around tomatoes and sauce, and like Americans kind of both taking in Italian foodways and like this kind of immigrants' gifts movement, but also rejecting them and pointing to their foodways as ways of being particularly un-American. And so fungi, and particularly hunting for fungi, was part of that. And then you're competing over the same spots and finding that, you know, your mushrooms that you feel like you want to use for a specific purpose are no longer there. And so that competition breeds cultural conflict. And another question.
That for the time, the turn of our century, was abnormal for women to be so involved?
I think mycology was a unique space. The question was it abnormal for women to be so involved? I think mycology offered a unique space, particularly in that it offered lay people, so non-professionals, non-academics, a way to be involved in this at multiple levels. So in this era, we see many more women who are finding careers, who are going to school, who are pursuing, you know, into kind of intellectual fields in all kinds of sciences and humanities as well, in astronomy and botany, in all kinds of things. But mostly there's this kind of cap, and you have to get beyond kind of, what's the word, legitimization. And the barriers of legitimization in mycology were lowered and were different because it had this culinary bent, and because it started out as this kind of popular field. And so the way that that women were able to participate is a lot broader and a lot more varied, I would say. Yeah, so is it this drawing here? Yeah, I just wanted to ask more about this drawing. So this is from the Boston transcript. It's 1896, which means that it's just about a year after the founding of the first Mycological Club. I really like it for a few reasons. First of all, it's so silly. It's got this real sense of humor about it. And I think sometimes when we think about the past, we don't always think of it as having a lightness to it. And even though there are many serious implications and serious vectors that I talk about, there's also a real sense of joy in this that I think really comes across. And then there's also a real sense of community and, you know, and linking literally of the hands in this image that that I think speaks to both that in that community and also that internalness of it a little bit, right? There's the finding your people, but then there's also the kind of blinders of who else you might be not seeing by your actions or by your inactions. And so I think this image really plays with a lot of that going on at once. Yeah.
There was one slide that had my hometown like written on it, Natick, Mass.
Okay.
I didn't get a chance to read it or anything before it went away. I saw that. I don't know if you know one.
I think it would be one of the,
There, that one. Yes.
this one here, okay, yeah, so this is a Lucille Blackforte peck that is named after Eliza Blackford, who was a very talented illustrator and the president of the Boston Mycological Club. And she collected all over Massachusetts, Natick included. Yeah, and you can see from so many of the illustrations and the notes from people from this time period, kind of the paths that they took, and so many of them are really similar to the gathering grounds that we still use today. And so it's been incredibly gratifying for me to be able to kind of retrace that and literally retrace the steps and walk in the same footsteps and look for the same organisms that folks were looking for more than 100 years ago. So this one is a little bit later, it's 1924.
Anything with the imagery and fashion, like nowadays, you know, mushroom fashion is big, but in their time, is that something as well?
With the images of mushrooms, we have the skirts, but I think that's just an illustration. So one thing that I have come across is usage of the terminology of fungi and mushrooms really picks up after this era. And so in the 1890s, skirts and sleeves were getting really big. And often people would call those mushroom sleeves or hats, the way that hats kind of changed shape during this era. Call them like mushrooming hats. And so the way that language around mushrooms is used is utilized in fashion, but I haven't seen either kind of specific use of either mycological materials, like which we do see now, mushroom leather and things like that, or kind of fashion that's inspired by fungal life specifically. I'm gonna check the chat and just see. Okay. That's another question.
On like mushroom clubs from the Northeast and also from like Colorado and like Pacific West. I'm wondering if you saw anything from more like the Southern United States specifically. I just wondered, like, I come from the sea, there's like lots of fungi there, and lots of people interested in fungi, but it would also, it could make sense to me if there's more like infrastructure socially for like a mycological club in like the North.
Yeah, I think you have it right when you say social infrastructure. So mycological clubs didn't always follow where the most fungal life was. They followed where opportunities for club life, society life, gathering, and education were. And for folks who, so for, like I mentioned, a lot of the folks who were participating in mycological clubs were educated people with who were fairly affluent with leisure time and part of the kind of broader club movement that was arising at this time. So lots of clubs are happening at this time, not just mycological clubs, although I think they're particularly interesting, obviously. And so there may have been kind of smaller pockets, but I haven't seen any particularly to that region. But there were certainly pockets like in Minnesota and in Ohio, there was a big mycological club. It kind of also depended where universities were, because a lot of these were in direct conversation with one or two really passionate individuals who were either working in the academic scholarly space or who were lay people who were just incredibly passionate. In Minnesota, it's just like Mary Whetstone, just like by force of absolute nature of personality kind of sustains this club. I think, emphatically, not really. And I think that's one of the things of lost knowledge and lost information, right? There is this sense of kind of general romanticization that happens of individuals who are closer to the earth, know things that we don't, and we should take advantage of that and not let it go to waste, right? But that's a very narrow lensed approach that is also echoed in the kind of over romanticization of how Indigenous people, how First Nations were really looked at by many, not all, white Americans at that time. And so there's not transfer of knowledge, but there's this kind of fuzzy understanding of knowledge that then again is kind of tamped down, like that exists over here and it exists in the past. And so there's in history, there's concepts of like the collapse of time and culture. And so that's part of the collapse of time and culture, this idea that for certain people, it's this past and pastoral pastime. Wow, that's a lot of pasts. And then for the mycological enthusiasts, for the club members, it's this like modern, scientifically minded, genteel kind of foraging. And I would say there's that same kind of romanticization going on with many of the immigrant cultures. And there's lots of articles saying like, in Russia, women go out and do this, and like we should be doing this, and why don't we? And we can do it better, basically.
So I think it's pretty clear there throughout history. But would you say American First Nations actually have like
The question was, is America the first nation to have a real push toward the scientific field of mycology? I would say they're part of that scientific push, but Germany and Italy, Germany kind of being the leading center of collegiate scholarly work in the 19th century, was early on of it for sure. And some of kind of the first like major mycological texts were not American. In the US, you have this very kind of disparate field, kind of one or two people at a time, kind of laboring, and kind of the person who's considered the father of American mycology, Steinitz, is actually Hungarian, I believe, and he goes back to Europe to once he gets really interested to study, because he just doesn't have a mycological community here at all. And then there's another individual, M.A. Curtis, who is kind of the premier collecting mycologist in the Carolinas in the 1860s, and he does some really interesting stuff where he's putting forward ideas about feeding troops, Civil War troops, with mushrooms while they're kind of on the go, that foraging, and that's kind of ignored, and then it's many years kind of before like there's a few more mycologists, and then it's really in like the 1880s, 1890s that it takes off. So it's in pockets, and it's very kind of disparate. And like Mary Banning, who's a real foremother of American mycology and a beautiful illustrator. And if anyone's on the Northeast, there's an absolutely fantastic exhibit of her work for the first time at the Albany Institute of Art at the New York State Museum. up in Albany. But she's working in like the 1870s or so in Maryland, and she's basically like, she talks about going out and everyone calls her like the crazy toadstool lady. And she makes this unbelievably beautiful series of plates, hand illustrated, gorgeous plates that sat in a drawer for 100 years, until they've just been unearthed recently. So pockets, but certainly the United States was not on the forefront of this. Very mycophobic. Yeah, and it's also like mushrooms were not classified as their own kingdom until 1967. They were in Linnaeus's kind of last category of the cryptogams. They're kind of like pushed to the side. They're weird. They're not popular. They're, for a long time, they were just kind of this neglected organism, kingdom. Yeah, they were pretty, right. So they thought of themselves as kind of open at a certain level. However, they were pretty, internal to those who were kind of affluent, educated. There are cases of like people coming in and telling stories at clubs of like, oh, like I saw this Italian who like tried to sell mushrooms to this restaurant and I stopped him and like I'm the hero, and the something that I didn't talk about too much in this talk, but the questions of edibility are more fuzzy than one might think. And so there are lots of cases where there are encounters and there are like well-meaning perhaps encounters between clubs and immigrant communities, but they're not always listening encounters. Yeah, they're often kind of tamping down encounters, less than like exchanging. Okay. I will repeat the questions for the Zoom viewers. Thank you. Yes. I think we have.
Do you have any thoughts on like what historians like yourself might be saying about 21st century mycological societies in America and abroad?
Do I have any thoughts about what historians in 100 years might be saying about mycological societies? Let us hope that there are historians in 100 years. I think that with mycology specifically, there is this continual sense that we're new and we're weird. And like people haven't looked at mushrooms before and like now we're doing it, right? And there's millions to find and it's this very kind of open, quirky, fertile space. And that was exactly the kind of language that was being used in the 1890s, when this kind of first mushroom fad came about. And so maybe in 100 years, historians will kind of be able to put together the pattern a little bit better of how interest waxes and wanes and think about, why that's the case. And I hope that they'll be saying, wow, those mycological enthusiasts, academics, scholars, and advocates really helped change things around and, and move humanity forward in important ways. Because I think that many of us might agree there's so much potential in fungi, and we're at such a point of potential. And so hopefully they'll be saying good things. Yes, in the back. Any research, so the question was about if there was any research on psilocybic mushrooms during the time period that I studied, particularly in that kind of culinary, feminine coded space. Okay. So not really, just because folks weren't really focusing on that. There are cases of what they would call toadstool poisoning, and what was described as toadstool poisoning, either from psilocybic varieties or from amanitas, was just kind of lumped under that umbrella of poison. So again, the levels of like what is edible, what is not edible are murky boundaries sometimes, but there wasn't really study into like hallucinogenic impact specifically. Not that I've seen, at least, because people would, like, there were cases of like, I took this mushroom and boy, I really looked at the fire for like, like so long, and it was so weird, and like dogs are really weird, like people will like talk about their like experiences that we might recognize today as hallucinogenic experiences. And in Russia and among Russian communities and some Eastern European communities, amanitas were eaten purposefully for that, to induce that impact. But in terms of like how we think about psilocybin and other altering fungal substances today, there wasn't quite that language yet.
Slides, right?
Yeah, so amanitas were definitely known and thought about a lot and talked about, particularly as like poisonous mushrooms, but then also talked about as like, well, some people eat them and what's, happening here. And so there was understanding of their impact, but it was just kind of called like mushroom drunkenness, if that makes sense. But yes, definitely conversations about amanitas were going on. I'm sorry, would you repeat that question a little louder? On the religion, oh, that's a good question. I haven't seen it, but I'm going to be honest, I haven't specifically looked into like religious impact, or like certainly in indigenous communities, fungi have long been used in rituals and in sacred spaces. But beyond that, I haven't really. Yeah, thank you. That's a good thing to look into. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I'm always happy to chat more. I will happily make my email available if there's, any additional thoughts, questions, if you want to see any of the sources more up close. And thank you so much for for having me and for listening and for thinking with maybe a different part of the brain for a mycological meeting.